So obviously, LS's move into Cloud9 and his mindset on the game is one of the huge topics coming into the LCS this year. And I think something Fudge said or kind of referred to in his post-game interview after beating Evil Geniuses on Sunday really gave an interesting access point into this whole conversation. So I want to look at what he said and then start to break apart what it means and how it ties into this overall discussion of LS's Cloud9 and what we can expect from them going into the future. So let's take a quick look at what he said.
What are your thoughts on EG in terms of the threat that you expected them to be going into this?
Honestly, going into this game, we thought that they were better than us as a team in general. So we didn't want to really play standard composition, which is also why I decided to first time Soraka on stage in 4-5.
Wait, so if you consider them more of a threat, are we more likely to see unconventional drafts like this?
I would say that it's just a way of surprising them because...
So let's leave aside the comments about Fudge and Cloud9 seeing Evil Geniuses as the superior team, because that's not really the point here. And I think Cloud9, several members have been pretty open at different points about saying they expected to kind of start kind of slow and that it's going to take a while to ramp up. They only very recently got their full team together. I want to look into Fudge's comment about surprising Evil Geniuses, playing something unconventional, and the motivations for doing that. And then we're going to tie that into expectations for LS's Cloud9. And kind of, like I said, the entry point into that large conversation. So let's just start by understanding what it means to have a surprise pick and why you might do it. And I think the big question is, as Fudge said, they did this because they thought they were up against a superior team and they didn't want to play something standard, because the idea is if you play a standard composition against a standard composition, you have the same kind of burden of execution on both sides, then the team that is superior in execution is going to win. So if you think that your level of execution, your ability to meet that burden of execution isn't as high as your opponent, you're going to throw in something that is a surprise. You're going to throw in something that places a higher, what I would call a higher burden of concept on the opponents. We're bringing in a concept, we're bringing in an idea that the opponents are less familiar with than us. And I'm setting up this kind of distinction between, or this kind of opposition between a burden of execution and a burden of concept. Where the burden of execution is, how well do you, it's kind of like a degree of difficulty in ski jumping or something like that, where you say, how difficult is it to pull off whatever this plan is, and how well did we achieve that? That's the burden of execution. So the first part is the burden of concept. Is this a really high complexity, high difficulty idea? And the second is, how well did we actually perform on that? And when you bring in a surprise pick, when you do something like pick an Ivern mid or a Soraka mid, or even a Sona support at this point, which is really non-standard, and Cloud9 brought all three of those out in their first two games, you're placing a higher burden of concept on your opponent and saying, we are more familiar with this than you, so your kind of gap between understanding of what your concept is going to be harder. We can execute this concept better than you can. And so you can kind of throw the opponent off, either by out-executing them or by out-concepting them, understanding them better. And so I think there's a really good example of using this to overcome a superior opponent when we look back at a previous Worlds tournament and see Ignar from Misfits, and you might remember this special moment from the Worlds tournament in 2017.
Need to be able to go aggressive, or you can't do anything. Well, they try to get to the front already. Ignite goes down immediately. No flash forward, but the heal comes out. They turn to Wolf as Bang feels like he can get back into the fight. Just 158
has no heal.
on Sama. One more shot as Wolf wants the glitter lands. Bang almost dead. Barrier comes in. Blood onto Bang. Fight in the jungle still. Here comes Sama. Wolf's going down. 2 kills in the bot lane as Misfits.
So you can see in that clip, and you might remember from that if you've been following the scene long enough, that the Fervor of Battle rune on Ignar caught SKT T1 off guard. They did not expect him to get that many autos out and do that much damage, and that kind of stole a game, or it contributed very heavily to stealing a game for Misfits, and they pushed SKT to a 3-2 series and could have beat them, which would have been a really massive upset. But these surprise picks or surprise strategies are not only a way to pull upsets if you are, very heavily the underdogs in a series or in a game. Just look at this example for one where it's between two more evenly matched
Well
teams.
against Rumble once he can get to Spectre's cow.
Yep.
But when we're talking about who has
That's
the pushing lanes, they actually have done
an insta-lock misfortune.
something really weird. I don't care about my last point. Support MF, or is it support Ash?
No. I wonder if he's spelled
20
the...
seconds past support MF.
It is support him.
The misfortune pick it's at support did manage to win Rocks 2 games in a row in that series, put them up 2-1 in the series. But then, of course, SKT banned it, and they won games 4 and 5 and ended up coming out ahead in the series overall. And so I think what you can take away from these examples and looking at many others throughout the history of League of Legends or even in other games is that playing really high concept and throwing curveballs and playing surprise strategies, it's really great for kind of stealing best of 1 game wins. It's great for picking up games in best of 5s, but it's not a method for carrying an entire best of 5. It can warp the series in your favor by forcing them to ban something out or whatever it is, but this is something that you bring out now and then to give yourself an edge, either because you're up against a superior opponent or because it's just going to, warp things in your favor even when you are evenly matched. So I think what this all leads into, and the thing that is much more interesting, is Fudge acknowledging they were throwing a surprise pick at Evil Geniuses, and they're coming at it from the, hey, we need something to do to feel like we're going to upset them because we're the underdogs. And how does this play into Cloud9's overall mindset and LS's overall mindset for leading this team? And the big question, I think, is, are Cloud9 going to be kind of, at their core, a high-concept team? A team that throws curveballs and tries to place a higher burden of concept on their opponents, rather than trying to play the same as everyone else but out-execute? And I think when you look at what they've done so far, and we're only going to look at their first 2 games in the regular season because lock-in, they didn't have their whole roster, LS wasn't here. I don't think those games really count into this. But so far, they've played 2 high-concept games. Basically, the same kind of concept, with the Enchanters in mid lane playing Ivern, and then playing Soraka. But it's 2 high-concept games, 2 kind of curveball games. And for sure, LS has other concepts in store, and the coaching staff and the players have other concepts in store that they're going to bring out. Probably they'll hold on to them until they have, their next opponent that feels like a threat. But they are going to play standard games. They have to play standard games. Nobody has a full season's worth of curveballs in store. And if that's all you ever did, then it becomes predictable in its own way. The really interesting part is that I think LS standard is going to be different from mainstream standard. And I want to explain what I mean by that. So LS, in his content and stuff, he's always been very outspoken about how he views the game, what he sees as important, what he thinks is ideal. He always prioritizes scaling in late game. He wants to force the enemy team to beat you before the clock runs out on them, and just, our composition beats your composition because we've had enough time to kind of hit our power spikes. Playing Enchanter mids fits into that LS standard. So those were curveballs in a certain sense, but not from the LS perspective of, hey, we want to maybe sacrifice a little bit in the early game, but as long as you don't beat us badly enough, we're going to be stronger later because we have a composition that is activated much more powerfully than yours. LS has always championed freezing. And this fits into this mindset because it's very CS efficient. It buys you a lot of time and allows the game to drag out by not letting towers go down earlier. You're not worried about trying to take control of the map and take towers and all that kind of stuff. You're saying, go ahead, have the map. We're getting minor incremental advantages as the clock ticks forward into our advantage. And it's only punishable, this game plan, if the enemy team makes really aggressive, coordinated map plays in response. And those aggressive, coordinated map plays have a very high execution burden compared to playing passively and freezing and controlling the pace of the game that way. So it fits into that mindset as well. And LS also, within all of this, tends to value bottom side control and orientation. He tends to value dragon stacking and dragon focus over herald control, because dragons put the enemy team on a clock saying, hey, every 5 minutes, you've got to worry about us stacking another one and eventually hitting a dragon soul. Whereas taking the herald puts your own team on a clock saying, we have to use this herald to up the pace of the game, apply pressure, and snowball it. Because if all you're doing is using herald for turret plate gold, then you could have gotten more by just spending that time on things that are more directly monetizable and more reliable. So yes, in a meta sense, Cloud9, when you look at all these things, they're going to be a high concept team because they're going to be playing into the LS standard, not the mainstream standard. And that is by default a different way of approaching the game. It is a different concept on the game than many other teams, or I'd say most other teams play. And if you really want to boil that LS standard down, I'd describe it as kind of saying to the opponent, you must do something difficult, something that is high execution. Otherwise, our game plan will eventually overpower your game plan. And that's why I tweeted after the second game, I said, that's 2 Cloud9 wins now where they've challenged the enemy with a come-at-me comp, either in a macro sense with scaling in Game 1, or in a micro sense with disengage and a protect Berserker comp in Game 2. Arguably, they played protect Berserker comps in both games. And the opponent has failed the challenge both times. So the LS mindset, or in this case, the LS standard playstyle, is working great so far. I think Cloud9 will also be kind of high concept or curveball-y in a lot of individual drafts, but it's more interesting to talk about this overall shift in approach in LS standard and what that means. I think this leads to a lot of takeaways and expectations or potential expectations for what might happen over the rest of the year as we go beyond just one weekend of this, where so far 2 opponents failed to kind of live up to the bar Cloud9 set and said, hey, you've got to jump higher than this, because if you don't, we just win by default. We're putting the onus on you to overpower our concept. Just because 2 opponents have failed to do that so far doesn't tell the story of the entire year. So I think there's some things we can take away and expect from this. We can look at Cloud9's kind of single game, cheese strategies, if you want to call them that. I don't think it was really heavy cheese when you put it in context, but if you look at it a single game kind of burden of concept composition, that should work very well in best of ones, right? They're going to take some games off of people who won't have time to adapt to them. But that approach will be tested a lot more strenuously in best of 5 series, when the opponents have time to adapt between games, and also when you're playing multiple series on the same patch over the course of a few weeks, and opponents have a chance to look at what you did against the previous opponent and adapt to that. If Cloud9's meta-level concepts, if the LS standard kind of overtakes the league during spring, then you have to expect that other teams are going to buy into that by summer and start to pick it up themselves, which will eventually create a shift from Cloud9 setting a burden of concept to the other team to now we're both playing to the same concept and it's just an execution matchup, a burden of execution similar on both sides. So what that kind of means is that if Cloud9 continue to rely too much or rely fully on kind of the LS standard playstyle, there are a few different outcomes. On the extreme, on the one end, if they dominate the league, especially in, win the spring split and go to MSI and all of that, then they're going to lose the concept advantage over time. They'll have more time in practice than their opponents using those winning concepts, and that'll be an advantage, but it's not going to be a persistent, we played the right way and you played the wrong way, and we're always going to be ahead, because the other teams are going to come up to that, and it's going to be a minor advantage over time. On the other end, the other extreme, if Cloud9, if this approach doesn't pan out over the course of spring and doesn't put them in that kind of league-winning position, if they do very poorly by their standards, let's say they finish like 5th or worse, they're either going to have to lean even harder into these concepts and place an either higher burden of concept on their opponents, or they're going to have to adopt the mainstream standard. And that will mean that they've had less time in practice on kind of the mainstream fundamentals, and that'll put them at a disadvantage. And of course, there's a middle of the road, and as in all cases of these kinds of argumentation, this is the most likely to happen, but I would say, but there's a scenario where Cloud9 kind of go 3rd or 4th or maybe even 2nd, and they're going to say that their lack of dominance probably was because of execution deficiencies on their own mindset is the most likely. Or they could identify, like, we've got to shift a little bit closer to the mainstream standard, but more likely they're going to say, our LS standard is still right, we have to up our execution, and they're going to be constantly battling through this tension of trying to out-innovate their opponents while those opponents try to out-execute Cloud9. So I think this is, when you boil all that down, that's what makes this year so fascinating for LS and Cloud9, is that they are placing on themselves a higher burden of concept by playing a different standard than the other teams. And now we have to wait and see, does it go in one of those extremes, and how does that play out? And if not, what are they going to be how are they going to be balancing that tension? I don't think there's a scenario where Cloud9's superior, let's say it ends up being a superior outlook on the game, sets them miles ahead of the rest of the league. for the entire year. Because if it does, like I said, the other teams are going to pick up to that and either start playing the same way as them, or try to counter strategy it, and that'll be a whole interesting can of worms on its own. So all of this is just, to me, very fascinating, and I think it gets kind of complex and hard to predict exactly how it's all going to play out. But this is why we're all watching every single game from Cloud9 right now so closely, to see what happens, because every win starts to tip us in one direction, and every loss, once they start to come, and there will be losses at some point, start to raise those questions of, is the LS standard gonna hold up? So this is what I'm so excited to watch. I hope you guys are all really excited to watch it too. And these are some things that I think, especially as Cloud9 fans, that you can kind of pay attention to and see what direction the entire ship is starting to steer. So hope you enjoyed those thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the games coming up this weekend, and we'll see how it all plays out. Thanks for watching and supporting my content. I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and check out the channel memberships if you want to get access to custom emojis, special roles in the Oracle's Elixir Discord, and other perks.